welcome to the virtual theater talk for the reading of Spunk by Zora Neale Hurston, directed by Lily Ann Brown, a part of the Refocus project with Roundabout Theater Company. I am Nafisa Monroe. I'm a teaching artist with Roundabout, and I'm coming to you from the land of the Lenape people.
And my name is Ted Sod. I'm the education dramaturg at Roundabout Theater Company. I am now living in Deep River, Connecticut, once the home of the Wangan tribe, and also an all-abolitionist city during the Underground Railroad.
That's amazing. So much history there, huh, Ted?
Yeah, and I'm discovering it every day when I walk my new dog, Penny.
I love Penny. We could have a whole theater talk just about Penny.
Yeah, but this isn't about her, although I'm sure she'd like it to be.
No, this is about Spunk, a play by Zora Neale Hurston. But now, when I hear the word play and spunk, I think George C. Wolfe.
That's because George C. Wolfe in 1989 did an adaptation of some Zora Neale Hurston stories and used the title Spunk. It's a small cast, it has music, it's very popular, and George put it together not long after he had done The Color Museum, his runaway hit.
Mm-hmm. So now why don't we know about this play? Well, I guess we'll find out about that a little bit later on in the talk, huh? Zora was so fascinating. I should probably call her Ms. Hurston, but I've read so much about her, I feel like she's my bestie.
Well, she was the life of the party, evidently. Like when Zora entered a room, people looked and paid attention. She had a fierce intellect, and she grew up in an all-Black community that, never taught her shame or that she was, less than.
Will you tell us about her early life?
Absolutely, I'd love to. She was born in 1891 in Macon, I think it's Macon County, Alabama, and her family moved to Eatonville when she was a young girl. Eatonville was the first incorporated Black township, and Zora liked to say we had 5 lakes, 300 brown bodies, and 300 swimmers. What I love about Zora mostly is the fact that she really and truly saw the Black people in Eatonville succeed at whatever they did. She didn't have a sense of failure. She only had a sense of success. It wasn't until she broke free from that community that she encountered people who wanted to push her down. Mm-hmm. She was born in 1891. Her mother was Lucy, a school teacher and had a sewing business on the side. Her father, John, was a Baptist minister. And when her mother died in 1904, her life changed. She really and truly hated the woman that her mother was replaced by when her father remarried. She was much younger than her mother. And in fact, in stuff that I've read about Zora's life, she almost killed the woman in a fist fight. So she left then to go north. She began a career in the theater as a wardrobe mistress, basically, for a traveling Gilbert and Sullivan troupe, which led her to Baltimore and then to Washington, D.C., where she started to study at Howard University. And at Howard, she learned to write. It was in 1925 that she migrated to New York City to elbow her way in to the Harlem Renaissance, which was a remarkable time in Black history.
You mentioned 1925 as the year she moves to New York. One of the things that I read, well, many of the things that I read, seemed like 1925 kept coming up. So I've got 1925 moves to New York. 1925, in the documents that I've read, she starts studying at Barnard under the world-renowned anthropologist Franz Boas. 1925, she wins all kinds of awards for short stories and short plays that she's written, both for the Opportunity magazine. Actually, I'm not sure if she won with the Crisis magazine, which was W.E.B. Du Bois's magazine. And then she's also a founding member of the Krigwa Players, which was founded by W.E.B. Du Bois. It was the beginning of what Du Bois called the Little Negro Theater Movement. And the goal of that was, for this particular theater, for this theater movement, was to have plays that are by us, about us, for us, and near us. So those were the 4 challenges of starting a small theater. But this movement was intended to have small community theaters in many Black communities across the country so that we could really start to develop our theatrical presence, our dramatic presence in the world of theater. That was one of Du Bois's calls. Ms. Hurston, Zora, my bestie, was a founding member of this one in New York, in Harlem.
Well, she was on fire, and she was, accepted into this community. She was an amanuensis for Fannie Hurst at one point. She
Mm,
needed money. And so one of the ways she got money, because of her friendship with Langston Hughes, who adored her at the beginning. They had a
mhm.
falling out once they wrote a play together, which is probably, not a smart thing to do with your best friend if you're both temperamental. At any rate, both of them were subsidized by a patroness named Charlotte Osgood Mason. Ms.
Mm.
Mason had inherited a lot of money, came from money, and she was spending what is tantamount to $1 million on these African American artists. And Zora was one of them. She applied for the patronage, she got it, but it came with a lot of strings. I
Mm.
mean, Mason wanted to control the material that she was going to research. She allowed her, with her money, to go to the Bahamas, to Haiti, to the Caribbean, to do research on African American folklore. It allowed her to survive, especially since the Depression was right around the corner. The crash happens in 1929. So, you know, Langston broke off relationship with Mason because she was too controlling. She made these young artists, these African American artists, call her godmother.
Mm.
And there's actually a picture of them sitting on these little stools in front of her throne as she sat in the throne.
Oof.
So it was a bit, shall we say, queasy to see, but these people had to survive and they wanted to do their work, and this allowed them to do their work without doing menial jobs.
I want to just give our viewers a couple of definitions that I found, just so we're really clear on what we're speaking about when we talk about anthropology and folklore as it applies to Zora Neale Hurston. So anthropology, according to the UC Davis, is the systematic study of humanity. The focus of anthropology is on understanding both our shared humanity and diversity and engaging with diverse ways of being in the world. I think for me, that is the most beautiful way to describe anthropology. And then we have the area of anthropology that Zora Neale Hurston really focused on in her lifetime, which was folklore. She was fascinated by folklore. She became what you call a folklorian or a folklorist. So this is from Stith Thompson. The common idea present in all folklore is that of tradition, something handed down from one person to another and preserved either by memory or practice rather than written record. It involves the dances, songs, tales, legends, and traditions, the beliefs and superstitions, and the proverbial sayings of people everywhere.
This is remarkable because this is exactly what people who were enslaved had to do to preserve their traditions, their stories, their beliefs. Men and women and children who were enslaved used song, dance, and storytelling because they were, not allowed to practice their own traditions. So this is very much part of the African American tradition.
Absolutely.
That Zora is collecting, really, kind of like the Grimm's brothers did. They went all over Germany and collected all the folk tales that they could. Became the Grimm stories that we all love. Zora was doing the same thing.
Not only did she study the folklore of the South and gather those stories, she also in 1930, she traveled to the Bahamas. She traveled to Haiti in 1935. And even later, she went to the West Indies and Honduras and Jamaica. She was really interested in the stories and traditions and the folklore that was still existent from people who had been enslaved from generations that had come from Africa, but she was also interested in the new folklore of these peoples as now a freed generation of Black folk. Not only did she compile these stories in a book of folklore, she used all of this information in her artistry, in the play, in her language in the play Spunk, which she wrote 10 years after the short story. Do you want to talk about the short story a little bit? Or sorry, you were going to say something.
No. I would love to. The short story is very different. I don't know if we mentioned that it won a prize for Opportunity Magazine, as did her play Color Struck. And that really started the ball rolling for her in terms of getting noticed during the Harlem Renaissance. The short story is very different. I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but
Okay.
he romanticized the play version a
Mm.
bit more than the story itself. Very much like, you know, a play written much later, The Rainmaker, where an outsider named Spunk comes into a community, probably based on Eatonville, and changes the dynamic drastically.
Zora Neale Hurston was really ahead of her time. And that may be why she just didn't see the level of success that she was worthy of in her lifetime. This play involves, they've without spoilers, it's got folk music all up in there. It's got a large, beautiful cast. It's got dances. It's got ritual. And in fact, I would argue that it was the precursor to a lot of the Black theater movement that happened in the 60s and 70s. In the 60s and 70s, the Black theater movement actually defined a type of theater called ritual theater. And I think Zora has touches on that here in this play in Spunk. I feel like she just brought her entire self to all of her work, right? She didn't leave a piece of it behind. She would show up and say, this is what I'm doing. I'm bringing all of me, all of my knowledge, all of my ancestry, which I think for me is one of the things that also makes me a little sad, because I realize she died alone. I mean, do you want to tell us a little bit about her later life?
Well, I want to say that for me, Spunk would make a brilliant film. It's so cinematic, whether it's the play version or the short story version. And a lot of her pieces are extremely cinematic. And I, along with my wishes for a miniseries on the Harlem Renaissance, I wish somebody would put Zora's work on film.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, in the 40s, she actually went to Hollywood and was working there. She didn't last longer than 3 months. I think she was working as a writer and a script reader. And, you know, this is sort of the beginning of the end, because by 1950, she's not got much money. She goes back to Florida. She's working as a domestic. And ultimately, she has a stroke and she dies and is buried in an unmarked grave. So Zora never made more than $1,000 in her royalties from her work, which is really paltry amount of money for a writer these days. And certainly for a writer of her esteem, of her talent, she should have been recognized. I think what's really wonderful about Zora's arc is the rediscovery of her by Alice Walker. In the 70s, Alice writes an article for Ms. Magazine called In Search of Zora Neale Hurston. She had read her work. It had influenced her. This is before Alice writes The Color Purple and becomes rich and famous. So in this Ms. Magazine article, Alice says, I'm a poor artist, but I want to put a headstone on this woman's grave. She goes down, finds her grave, finds people who knew her, finds out how she died, under what circumstances, goes into this overgrown cemetery, which was like a welfare cemetery with snakes, finds the grave, and buys a headstone, the one she can afford.
This is what Alice Walker had put on Zora's headstone. Zora Neale Hurston, a genius of the South, novelist, folklorist, and put her new birthday, 1901 to 1960, the one that Zora gave herself. But what I would think is fascinating is that she was a folklorist and a novelist up until the 90s. Well, we knew she had written plays, but there was not much there up until the late 90s, when a scholar goes to the Library of Congress because they've got this list of Zora Neale Hurston plays, but they've never seen them. And they say, hey, what's up with this? And the Copyright Office that had sent everything to the Library of Congress was like, oh yeah, we've got that, because Zora, again, ahead of her time, wrote something, copywrote it, wrote something, copywrote it. That was what she did. And all of a sudden, 97, 98, we're rediscovering 12 plays that have been in existence and there that nobody had heard about or read or had their hands on. And that is where Spunk came from. And that is also the thing that really now solidifies Zora in the dramatist canon, as well as the novelist canon and the anthropologist canon and the folklorist and just the awesomeness canon, right? I mean, you look at pictures of this woman and you go, okay, yes.
Well, supposedly she entered a room and everybody's heads turned, and she knew how to have a good time. She wasn't much of a drinker, but she knew how to have a good time.
Absolutely.
And I think it's remarkable that this discovery in the late 90s of her unpublished, unproduced plays are being given its due. I mean, I love the fact. Now, I know that smaller theater companies have produced this play version of Spunk, but I don't believe that a major regional theater like Roundabout has ever taken on one of her plays like this. And
yeah.
I'm excited for this project, this Refocus project.
I am as well. I just want to share a couple of wonderful things that have happened since the rediscovery in the 70s that Alice Walker really brought about. Now, yearly, there is a Zora Neale Hurston Festival of the Arts in Eatonville every year, and it celebrates the arts and the humanities in her name. And she was also inducted into the Florida Artists Hall of Fame, which I think is just wonderful. Just fantastic. There's a scholar who I would like to share this quote before we say goodbye for today. This is a scholar by the name of Margaret Gillespie. She wrote an interesting article called Not a Thing of the Past, Zora Neale Hurston and the Living Legacy of Folklore. And this is a quote from that piece. It says, of Zora, hers was an innovatory modernist voice, and one that would nourish and enrich the cultural legacy with whose survival she deemed herself to have been symbolically entrusted. And I think that's exactly what Ms. Hurston has done with her writing and her life and her being.
And for those of you who are not familiar with her, this is a great opportunity to experience one aspect of her immense talent.
Absolutely. On our website, roundabouttheater.org, we will have additional resources if you're fascinated by any of the things we talked about. Thank you so much for joining us for the Theater Talk today. Again, I'm Nafisa. This is my colleague, Ted Sod. We hope to see you live and in person in the theater sometime soon. Fingers and toes crossed. Thanks for joining us.